Hey everyone, welcome to House Healthcare. It's Wednesday, April 19th, and we have Legislative Council with us this morning. We have two amendments to discuss on S37. So we're going to start with the first one, which is a technical amendment. So I'm going to turn it over to Amber.
Great. For the record, Amber Navajali, Legislative Council, and I'm going to screen share an amendment. And this is draft 1.1 dated 4/17 at 12:14 p.m. This is a technical amendment. If you recall, last Friday, we went through a markup version of the S37 House Healthcare strike all language. And within that, I had both the new language and the old language, so you could see where we were striking through language from the Senate version. Unfortunately, some of that struck through language remained in the clean copy. The clerk's office notified me that they were not able to fix it internally as a Scrivener's error and requested that if this language indeed is supposed to be removed, that we do it by amendment. So the sections that the strike-through language remained in are in Section 6 and Section 7. This was the professional regulation language. We had adjusted the phrasing to make it clearer that the administrative action taken by another state could be by a licensing board, and that it could be either a civil or criminal action by someone even other than a licensing board. So we removed the languages or action and by a licensing board of another state in both Section 6 as well as in Section 7. And then, as you recall, we updated the healthcare provider definition so that it was no longer cross-referencing to 18 VSA 9496. And so I had struck that language in the markup version. So we are removing that language again for the version that's on the floor. So that is also in Section 6 and again in Section 7 in the second and fourth instances of amendment in this amendment. And then lastly, it looks like when I did the original draft 1.1 of the markup, I left out the reader assistance heading definitions above the definition section, and the clerk's office asked that I re-add that since the rest of the bill does have reader assistance headings.
So in simple terms, on the version that's on the House calendar, this is not struck out, and now we're striking it out.
Yes.
That's what we voted on.
Yes.
Got it. To be clear, it is struck out. It looks just like this. It's underlined and struck through. It was still showing the markup
On the House calendar.
on the House calendar. So this is removing what Amber had indicated would be removed. You had expected would be removed.
Just look at the House calendar, so I make sure I get this right.
Strike out in the same way.
Yes.
So, sorry, I just want to make sure. Okay, so explain that to me again.
So when we are putting language into statute, we reflect new language as being underlined. So any new language that's on the bill, that's on the calendar for review on the floor should have just an underline if it's new or just a strike through if it's being removed from statute. What we accidentally have here is underlined and strike through left over from the markup version, where I was showing you what was the proposed new language from the Senate that this committee wanted to strike through. Right? That's why it had both in our markup version, and it should only either have an underline or a strike through in the clean copy that goes to the floor.
It's only the strike through.
And we're only removing the one that has the double, the underline and the strike through, because that language should not be in there according to what you intended to vote out on Friday.
Okay. Does everyone understand that?
Not really, but
I can.
Good. I'm glad I'm not the only one. Wait, Leslie, hold on. I'm gonna let Aaron go.
It might be helpful if I show you.
In context?
Yes.
I know it's difficult seeing it just,
that's what I was gonna
probably
say.
should have started that.
That'd be great.
Okay. So let me go to
Exactly.
Going to the House calendar so I can pull up what others will be seeing.
Strike through.
So this is what we're looking at here. You'll see when I did the clean version, I should have removed action, removed by a licensed board of another state for the clean version. What we see here is both the Senate version as well as your markup of the Senate version.
Okay.
We don't want the markup aspect of it. We just want what you ultimately are voting to approve.
Okay, got it.
I probably should have started there in my explanation.
That's okay. No, that's okay. You all understand the language a lot better than at least I do. Leslie, finish off.
Talking about
You're fine.
where is that unprofessional? What's the reader assistance heading you're referring to?
Yes. So you'll see, for example, above this section 6, we have professional regulation. And above it, we have insurance coverage. And above that, we have medical malpractice. And then in the original Senate version, it used to say definitions right above section 1. So you know that the first section was about definitions. And when I created the strike all amendment, I accidentally dropped that reader assistance heading.
So that's right in section 1.
It's right above
Right at the
section
beginning,
1,
right at the
at the beginning of the bill.
Got it. So that's when you say enacting clause. Okay, got it.
Yes.
Great. So we need to take a strong vote on this.
I don't know what it is because I was talking to someone else about something, so I can't vote.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Okay. All those in favor of accepting this technical, what I'm going to say is a technical amendment. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You're not voting against it. You're just not voting.
Yeah, not without knowing what it is. I have another concern about the bill that might be a technical amendment that someone might bring to the floor if we don't fix it.
Okay. Can we just hold on that?
Yeah, I'm telling you, just so it goes on the,
Okay.
while we're on the topic of amendments, so we address it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So we have that one. All right. And now I think we're switching to Jen. And I can, while Jen comes up, I can give the background on this one. So in talking with people connected to care, who are here today to testify, there was a desire to bring this amendment forward. So I had asked Jen to put me as the sponsor. I'm open to other people to agree to sponsor it as well. It doesn't have to just be from me. But we'll have Jen walk through the language and then we'll have some testimony and then we can have some discussion. So Jen?
All right. Good morning, Jen Carby, Legislative Council. And so just by way of kind of orienting on a topic, and then I'll show you where we are in the bill. So as I'm sure you have heard, there's a lot going on at the federal or national level around medication that is used for termination of a pregnancy, also for dealing with pregnancy loss, miscarriage. The one in particular is mifepristone. So there's two, mifepristone and misoprostol. They sound unfortunately similar. And so the one that is getting attention right now and this the subject of litigation and is currently the subject of stay at the Supreme Court level that ends today. So there will probably be some more movement on this today is mifepristone, which is the first of those two drugs that are used in medication abortions. So the language that is in this amendment, which I will put up on the screen, is looking to address the situation regardless of what ends up happening at the federal level as far as FDA approval. So this amendment is, as the chair said, is currently under her name. We can add others if others wish to co-sponsor as well. It would amend the bill in section 1, which is the definitions, specifically the definition of reproductive health care services. And it's not changing anything in the definition that the words of the definition that we've looked at so far. I've simply made that subdivision C1. This adds subdivision C2, which would say that the term reproductive health care services includes medication that was approved by the FDA for termination of a pregnancy as of January 1st, 2023. So a date certain, we know it was approved at that point, regardless of the medication's current FDA approval status. And then for 2 purposes, when such medication is procured, ordered, stored, distributed, prescribed, dispensed, or administered, or a combination of those, by a person duly licensed under the laws of this state, as long as the licensee's actions conform to the essential standards of acceptable and prevailing practice for the licensee's profession, or when such medication is used by an individual. So those would be considered reproductive health care services that then get pulled into the definition of legally protected health care services. And so all of the provisions in the rest of the bill and H89, where an identical amendment is being proposed, would apply. So a couple of things, and then I know you have other witnesses to hear from. One of them is, and I'm learning about this by educating myself and by consulting with OPR, who is here as well, and others, is that the FDA approval of a medication really matters for the manufacturer. It applies to the marketing and sale and distribution of a medication. Whether a medication that is not FDA approved can be prescribed by a licensed provider or dispensed by a pharmacist is really outside of the scope of what the FDA focuses on. The FDA is about the safety and approval of medications that can be sold in the marketplace. So what this language is doing here is saying that this language would protect providers, dispensers, anybody who is a licensee in our system who procures, orders, stores, that's all, distributes, that's all kind of on the acquisition side, prescribes, dispenses, or administers this drug, as long as doing so is consistent with the standards of practice for their profession. And this language here on lines 18 and 19 about conforming to the essential standards of acceptable and prevailing practice for the licensee's profession is language that we took directly from the OPR and Board of Medical Practice statutes. So practice that does not conform to those standards can be part of what is considered unprofessional conduct. So this is using that language to say, as long as they're behaving consistently with what is considered the prevailing practice for their profession, which can be prescribing medication that is not FDA approved, if that is what the profession is deeming appropriate, then that would be considered reproductive health care services that are subject to the protections in these bills. So those are the 2 things I wanted to say to kind of frame how this is set out, recognizing that what is happening nationally may not have to do with what is necessarily appropriate or prevailing practice among the professions that prescribe and dispense in this area, but may have other implications that are affecting its FDA approval status. And so in order to take Vermont providers, healthcare providers and patients out of what's going on kind of nationally in that landscape, this is saying if it was FDA approved on January 1st and we know which drugs those are, then those can continue to be prescribed and dispensed and acquired as long as doing so is consistent with the standards of practice. So if there are changes to the standards of practice because of developments, for example, in understanding the drug safety or efficacy, then it would no longer be protected. That's why that language is there about it being conforming to the essential standards of acceptable and prevailing practice. So it doesn't lock us in if there are medical or scientific reasons that that medication is not appropriate for patients, but it does otherwise try to protect the continued usage of the medication.
Great. Alyssa and then Brian.
I think I'm just confused by line 20, the or and the be. Why is that in there?
This is just to protect, so if you just read from the lead-in language, reproductive health care services includes medication that was FDA approved as of the beginning of this year, regardless of its current FDA approval status, when the medication is used by an individual. So if somebody takes that medication, for example, somebody from another state comes to Vermont and gets that medication and takes it, then we're still trying to protect what our providers have done.
Brian. Oh, okay, Brian and then Topper, Leslie and Art.
Yeah, I just want to like summarize what I think it does so I make sure I understand it, it's kind of codifying that if a medication currently, or at least before 2020, recently, not currently, but recently, that if medical science supported the use of a medicine, that it protects, and that's more than use, actually. Okay, so let me try to say this simpler. It protects science from political attacks. I think that's a really overly simple way to say it now, but it protects the practice of science and the use of science from a political attack.
So I think I'm going to delicately step back from taking a position on that. I think what it's doing is it's protecting Vermont's providers and patients using medication in Vermont from the changing political and legal landscape around approval of these drugs.
When that is in opposition of the science and the medicine.
Right, when the
science and medicine,
when the standard of practice is that those are appropriate.
Okay, but if science and medicine changed and the political world changes, then we would change the way we use medicine.
Regardless of so this is just taking it out of the politics.
Yeah, okay, yes.
And saying, right, so if the standard of practice changes so that these medications are one or both of these medications are no longer considered the standard of practice by providers in these practice areas, then it would come out of our definition as far as protection goes.
And then this is just for medication-related to termination of a pregnancy.
Yes.
Is there another section of the bill that talks about medication related to gender-affirming healthcare?
We had generally in the definition of gender-affirming healthcare, we had the language that we also have up here around supplies, care, and services, and then we specifically added including medication. So medication generally is covered, but this is making a particular call out because of the changing landscape around FDA approval for these drugs to make it clear that their use is still allowable in Vermont.
Okay, so we could, this is like a question to the committee and I'm done. It's just that I am a little concerned, like what if there are attacks on gender affirming medication, but we could always revisit that, right? Like next year if we had to? Sure. Or does it need to be in here now to be, like, could it happen that quickly?
I think because we're looking specifically at drugs that were approved as of a date certain, and there is considerable risk that they will no longer be FDA approved in the near future, the recommendation from those who are practicing and regulating in this area was to specifically address these drugs.
Topper.
And on line 8.
Yep.
The term or supportive nature, that means supportive services for people who might be considering having an abortion and also people that are considering staying with the pregnancy, correct? So it's both sides?
That's how I read it. This is language that was in the bill that you already voted out. But yes, I mean, services, supplies, care, and services of a supportive nature, I think would be to support the individual, whether they're in a decision-making process or they have chosen a path and are continuing on that path. Right, whichever path, and there may be many paths.
Leslie?
Good.
Art?
Yes, Jen. C1, is it the same as C in the present bill?
Yes, yes, exactly. All I added was the one so that I could make it.
All right. That's one thing. The other thing is, does this affect at all the abortion reversing medication that we had talked about last week?
This does not get into that topic because I don't believe, these are medications that are used to cause abortion.
Right.
So it's protecting the use of those, but it's not getting into whether there are or are not FDA-approved medications to attempt to reverse.
But if they are, it would fall under here.
I don't believe so because these are medications that were FDA-approved for termination of pregnancy as of January.
That's all this deals with.
That's all this deals with. Termination of, yes, lines 12 and 13.
Yep, thank you.
Anyone else for Jen in the language? I think I'm going to actually have Stephanie come up first, if that's okay. And then we'll go to Lauren. So you can take the language down so you can see Lauren. Thanks, Jen.
Good morning, Stephanie Winters. I am the Deputy Director of the Vermont Medical Society. For this testimony, I also represent a number of other organizations, family physicians in Vermont, pediatricians in Vermont, psychiatrists, and then there's a broader group who worked with us on a press release about mifepristone as well, but I won't go into them. So I'll keep my testimony brief this morning. You're all aware, Jen and Amarin went into the recent litigation. You've most likely heard it on the news. And I will just say that medication abortion and the drugs that are used for that have been safely and effectively used since 2000 when the FDA approved them. So that's almost 23 years ago. And is the standard of care for not only abortion care, but also for medications used for the termination of pregnancy are also used in miscarriage, induction of labor for stillbirth, so that's later in pregnancy, induction of labor in live birth, postpartum and postmenopausal bleeding. And more recently, there's some research about uterine fibroids. So there's a lot that these drugs do to protect and support women and their health. So the overall purpose of S37 is to protect healthcare professionals providing and persons seeking and obtaining reproductive health services in Vermont from legal liability, professional sanctions. You guys took weeks of testimony on this. You know what the point of this is. And so this amendment would make it clear that those protections extend to medications approved by the FDA for abortions, but have broader uses regardless of their current FDA approval status. This will facilitate Vermont having mifepristone or misoprostol. We don't know, what will happen to many of these drugs in the courts on hand while it's still approved by the FDA, and protect the use of medication in the future if it should lose FDA approval. We have spoken with a number of practitioners who use this drug, and they said, if Vermont says it's okay, if the legislature tells me it's okay, and the Attorney General says it's okay, which we've met with her and she does, we will use it because it's evidence-based and it's standard of care, and it really helps women. So we support this amendment wholeheartedly, and we hope you do as well.
Any questions? Leslie? Elizabeth.
I just wanted to reiterate your testimony of what other uses these drugs are used for.
Sure. Besides abortion, they're used for induction of labor, for both stillbirth and live birth, early miscarriage, postpartum and postmenopausal bleeding. And there is some research and new findings about using in uterine fibroids.
Leslie?
I'm hoping that you could give your testimony to Claire.
I will type it up. This is just chicken scratch.
I'm wondering, I've heard in other states that there is stockpiling going on as we don't know what's going on, and wondering what's happening in Vermont in that arena.
We are working on that. We have met with legislative leadership. We have met with the Commissioner of Health. We've met with the governor's office. We're in communication and in process, but we don't have a resolution on that.
And what might it take? How can we help? I guess, instead of legislation, is important for providers to keep, if they don't have access, then that won't matter. So how can we help? Maybe we can't, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure at this point because it's so, the decision from the Supreme Court could come down at midnight tonight. So legislatively, I don't think there's time to do anything. So it's really in the administration's hands at this point.
Thank you.
All right.
And this question may not be for you, it may be for Jen a little bit more, but your testimony brings it to mind with the things other than abortion that these drugs could be used for. If we don't do this amendment, Jen, what happens with the use of these drugs? What if we do nothing?
So Jen Kirby, Legislative Council, if we do nothing and these drugs lose their FDA approval status, there's still an argument to be made that they can be used off-label for these other purposes, but there's less protection, I think, for the providers. Anytime something loses or is not FDA approved, I think there is greater risk to the provider in using it. Although if it is consistent with the standard of care, it's more protective. But I think that may be a good question as well for the regulators who are on the screen.
Okay.
OPR.
So we'll come back to that when we're done with Stephanie.
So I'm clear, if we do this affirmatively, and the Supreme Court comes down, then this is no.
No, Jen, you want to answer that?
What this is doing is really taking, to the extent we can, taking this issue out of the limbo that it is in at the national level right now. So if the Supreme Court directs the FDA to withdraw the approval, this medication can still be prescribed and dispensed. It may be more difficult to acquire because the FDA approval affects the marketing and distribution of the drug, but it would still be legal to be prescribed and dispensed.
That helps?
Yes, thank you.
Any other questions for Stephanie before we go to OPR? Great, thank you, Stephanie. Good morning, Lauren. Hey, Lauren.
Good morning.
So whoever wants to go first or however you all are doing this.
Sure. For the record, Lauren Hibbert, Deputy Secretary of State, and thank you for having us on this morning to talk about this amendment. The Secretary of State and the Office of Professional Regulation both really support this amendment. We think that it clarifies that a provider will not be putting their license at risk for following the standard of care and prescribing medication that may lose FDA approval in the future as soon as this summer or in the next couple of weeks. So we really do support this amendment. We think that it will provide assurances to the provider community. And the provider community obviously includes physicians, which Stephanie represents, but it also includes nurse practitioners, pharmacists, osteopathic physicians, and naturopaths, all who could and do prescribe this medication. So this has a wide net that it could affect, and we support this language being added to S37.
Great, thanks, Lauren. Any questions? Did Lauren, the other Lauren, you're just here together? Okay, great, just want to make sure. All right, go ahead, you want to ask first?
I don't know where the question lies, and I'm trying to understand what this does. It sounds like if today, tomorrow, tonight, whatever it is, that if the Supreme Court says these drugs are not to be approved, then we can still use it because they were approved as of January 1, 2023,
Yeah.
forever and
That answer that.
forever and ever and ever.
So the use of the January 1st date is really to peg it to a point in time so that we would know what was approved.
At
We know
that
what-
time.
Yes, we know what universe of drugs we're talking about.
Okay.
So if the Supreme Court directs the FDA to withdraw its approval entirely, it's my understanding that the drugs can still continue to be prescribed and dispensed in Vermont, regardless of the withdrawal of the FDA approval. There's a lot of nuance around the different parts of what the FDA is allowing that are different at different levels as far as who can prescribe and whether medication can be distributed by mail. Some of those I don't believe we can affect. Although again, I would look to the regulators, but I think to the extent that providers are allowed to or able to prescribe medication that is not FDA approved, the withdrawal of the FDA approval does not affect practice in Vermont.
As long as this is in here.
I think arguably it may be possible without the language, but there's significantly less protection, I think, perceived on the part of the providers without the language. So having it specific in here so that they know, for example, that their licensure is not in jeopardy if they're prescribing medication that has lost its FDA approval, that's why the language is proposed for inclusion.
Do you know, Jen, and you may not know, of any other drug we do this for, that we make an exception so that we here can continue to use the drug?
I'm not particularly aware of drugs that have lost FDA approval through the courts. So this is kind of a unique situation in that sense. Typically, if a drug loses FDA approval, it's because of well-documented scientific problems with the safety or efficacy of the drug. And so I think it would be contrary to the standard of care for providers to continue to prescribe it. In this case, it's kind of external forces acting upon the FDA's regular approval process. And so no, I'm not aware of anything we do this with, but there is a lot of prescription or recommendation of medication that is not FDA approved if it is available, because that is what is the standard of care. And there's a lot of off-label prescription of medication, which means the FDA approved it for one purpose, but medical community has determined that it's useful for other purposes. And so the manufacturer doesn't go back to the FDA to ask to have the label updated to reflect all of those other uses. But there's broad recognition by the FDA and the medical community and the regulatory community that that is appropriate as well.
So I can get the whole story here. So we're stockpiling this.
We are not at this moment.
We are not
My
at this
understanding
moment.
stockpiling.
Some states are probably. Okay.
Yes.
And is there a shelf life to all these beds?
Stephanie Winters, Vermont Medical Society. We are working like other states to stockpile. We are not there yet. And there is a shelf life. The manufacturer is 2 years, but other entities say 2 to 5 years. But we're going based on a 2-year possibility of stockpiling.
Any other questions, or Lauren, anything else you want to add?
No, I just wanted to, before Jen added the off-label use, I just wanted to mention that drugs do change what they're approved for, or they're utilized in a way that they were not previously approved for. And this really protects any off-label use of these drugs in the future. And we really don't know where the courts and the FDA are going to land on these particular drugs approval. So again, this amendment really codifies the provider's ability to use their own professional judgment following the essential standards of care and use these drugs regardless of FDA approval or the court status.
Thanks, Lauren. Did you have a question?
I do have a question. First of all, thank you to everyone for working on this bill. It's incredibly important to me. Under Big A, I'm questioning whether this protects everyone who would be working on or working with the medication. For example, is there any situation where someone's profession doesn't outline one of these practices? Or, for example, someone who works in a back office at a medical facility and isn't licensed to be working with the medication, but handles it in the storage.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Are they protected
Yes.
under this?
We worked very closely with Legislative Council and the Vermont Medical Society, and I should have said at the outset, are very grateful for this work. We talked about those words: procured, ordered, stored, distributed, prescribed, dispensed, or administered, or combination thereof. That covers all of the occupational licenses in Vermont. For someone who does not hold a license, this section is really relevant to people who are holding an occupational license. So if you look back at the structure of the bill, this protects somebody who holds an occupational license from being disciplined by our state. And so all of those, modifiers are applicable to the professions that are in this field. So really, it's pharmacy and the prescribers and the nurses who would administer. And so we're confident that those words cover all the occupational licenses and the related activities. The person who's in the back office is operating under the delegation of a licensee. So I would think that they would still be covered by that language.
Okay, thanks, Lauren.
Yeah.
Sorry. Any other questions? Great, thank you, Lauren and Lauren. So I think what I want to do is just take like a 3-minute break, give everyone a chance to look at this since it's, noon. And then we'll come back and do a straw vote. But first, Leslie.
I was just wondering when you want to add sponsors, because I'd like to be one.
Okay, so why don't we, on the 3-minute break, if you want to be a sponsor, come to me. And then we'll come back in 3 minutes and we'll vote. You can go.